thank you for welcoming me. As Cody mentioned, I'm Teresa Carbone, the Gettysburg College intern at the Seminary Ridge Museum right now, and I'm going to be talking to you about the debates over the right to secession as they relate to the American Civil War and to secessionist movements in general throughout history. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. The question of the right to secession has been an inherent part of American political theory from the very beginning of our existence as a country. As you all are certainly aware, the American colonies also had no legal right to secede from the British Empire. They went to war for it, as we all well know. However, because of the narrative around the American Revolution, and because of, frankly, the fact that we won the American Revolution, we remember this as a righteous rebellion against the evil, oppressive British Empire. We do not remember it as a failed put-down rebellion, and we are all not speaking Her Majesty's English, or His Majesty's English, I should say. So I believe that the way that these revolutions are remembered can have as much impact on our beliefs in their causes, and whether or not these revolutions were won can have as much impact on our belief in their causes as the actual causes behind them. But this does not mean that we should not be evaluating the actual motives behind these secessionist movements with critical eyes. Political science has actually always struggled to discuss secessionism as an ideology, including rationalizations of secession and the very concept of the right to secede. The forefathers of political thought, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, only acknowledged the idea of secession as a hypothetical. Both of them were political theorists operating within the worldview that prioritized the absolute power of the monarch. Both of them basically did not believe that, there were rights for the people, except for the concept of the natural rights, like liberty and property. We do not see a right to self-determination necessarily in here. We do not see a right to secession. We do not see a right to creating one's own nation apart from that which was ruled by your monarch. No real analysis of secessionism actually really occurred in the field of political science until after the Civil War, practically. Even the American Revolution did not spark as much debate about it as the Civil War did. And honestly, frankly, there still hasn't been a very good look at secessionism as an ideology. We look at, especially in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of the secessionist movements there sparked a lot of political scientists. Basically, every abstract I read when I was researching this started with something like, we haven't done enough to talk about secession in this field. And they were all written, basically in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, like I said. But during the Civil War and after the Civil War, the righteousness and legality of secession were hotly debated throughout the nation, which, interestingly enough, includes right here in this building, both during the war as a topic of interest, but also while this building was being used as a field hospital. We have recollections from soldiers talking about how Confederate and Union soldiers who were here as patients were arguing with each other over whether or not secession was justified and whether or not it was legal. Even these individual, probably lowly soldiers had their own strong opinions on whether or not there was actually a right to secede. So we have both legal and moral arguments from both sides. The Union legal argument, which is actually kind of complicated to parse, was that the states could not secede because the United States was not created as a union of independent states, but as one nation subdivided into states, and thus the nation was created by the people of the nation and not the states. Basically, the argument here is that it goes that the people create the nation and then the nation creates the states, as opposed to the earlier system under the Articles of Confederation, where it was the idea that the people create the states and then the states create the nation. So under this new paradigm that's basically introduced when the Constitution is written, which is we the American people create the nation, states don't have the legal right to act as independent states, if you will. They only have the legal right to act as parts of the American nation, and thus they have no legal right to secede. Additionally, there was no right to secession in the Constitution. There was no means by which a state could legally leave the Union. They could not petition for it, they could not hold a referendum, they could not vote themselves out of the Union. So the only way to secede was illegally. Abraham Lincoln actually commented on the fact that if a state wanted to leave the Union, they would have to amend the Constitution to allow it. So it is very easy to say that there's no legal pathway for secession. However, the Confederate legal argument was the inverse of the Union argument. They argued that the United States was still a union of the states, and each of which retained the ability to act on their own and could choose to secede. We actually see a precursor to this argument in the nullification crisis, like specifically the argument of John C. Calhoun that states have the rights to disobey the federal government and nullify laws imposed by the federal government that they do not believe to be right. And meanwhile, we also see these moral arguments on both sides. The Union moral argument for preserving the Union, and going to war is also the moral argument for, of course, emancipating the slaves. And the Confederate moral argument actually is, I feel, the more interesting one here, because the Confederacy explicitly links itself with the rebellious American colonies of the Revolutionary War, arguing that they are experiencing the same kind of mistreatment from the Union as the colonies did from the British Empire, and thus echoing every argument that the American colonists made that they had a right to secede, that saying that the Confederacy can make the same arguments, basically. They're saying, they want to change our way of life, we're being economically stifled by them, we are giving to them more than they give to us. Just all of these arguments that have been made by the American colonies before them. So they are basically creating this narrative that, they are also being American by seceding. So, like the American colonies, additionally, the Confederacy repeatedly enumerated their reasons for secession. There's one Southern author who I'm going to focus on here, Albert Taylor Bledsoe, who listed 8 causes for secession in his book, Is Davis a Traitor?, which break down into 3 larger categories, which I'm going to give here. Number 1, balance of power. The shift of power from the states to the federal government, especially regarding the loss of power of the southern states. There's less representation for the interests of the South, as the North gradually illegalized or phased out slavery, while the South retained and relied on it. Basically saying the North has more power, the North does not rely on slavery, therefore getting rid of slavery is something that the North will not be adversely affected by, which makes it much easier for it to do for the South. He talks about how the constitutional compromises, such as the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Great Compromise that created the House and the Senate, were basically necessary to defend the South from the tyranny of the North. And he also argues that these aren't really truly compromises because the North still has more power than the South in the House and the Senate. He actually makes this one, I find, very funny argument, which is, he says, hey, why are you so mad about us counting slaves as 3/5 of a person? Women and children can't vote either, and you count them as whole people. So he's saying, there's more women and children in the North, they're being counted towards the census. We're only counting the slaves partway towards the census. It's crazy. Second reason, the relative decline of the South in the new Union, which is the gradual loss of power of the South when compared to the North and to the federal government. Also, the diminishing usefulness of slavery to the Southern economy. He's arguing that the South is giving more to the government than it's receiving, despite its contributions. He claims that the North is basically a faction directly opposed to the progress and well-being of the South, saying it basically proves that Madison's assertion that the Constitution would defend against the tyrannies of the majority and of factionalism was not true. He basically says, no, you have created this faction. This faction is going to overpower us and get rid of our way of life. The Constitution is not protecting us, so we are not bound by it. We can leave this union because it is not doing what it should to protect us. And he actually goes as far as to say that the framers themselves would want to dissolve the Union if they were alive to see 1861. He says that the framers would not believe that this is the nation they wanted to build, and they wouldn't want to see it taken apart. And his third reason is, of course, unjust treatment of the slavery question. Attempts to undo the protections of slavery originally in the Constitution. Basically, he says, the Constitution defends slavery, and the Supreme Court decisions that were made protecting the institution of slavery are there to defend it, to protect the South, to protect the Southern way of life and the Southern economy. Basically, the North is actively going against the promises we've made to each other, they're working against us. So they all really come back to the same idea, which is that the Constitution is no longer protecting us, so we're no longer bound by it. Which I find a very interesting way of looking at the whole affair, just because it shows this rather interesting understanding of the purpose of government that I've seen echoed in a lot of modern political debates, which is, the purpose of the government is to protect its citizens, and you have the whole idea that power is derived from consent of the governed, right? So if the government no longer consent, and if the government is no longer using its power to defend them, then what's the point of being in the government anymore? What's the point of remaining in the Union? Why would the South choose to remain if all they saw was the Union acting against them? Of course, Bledsoe is not an unbiased source. Yeah. I have provided this quote here to show just how interesting of a viewpoint he had, because I think the phrase, "Can reason strike the fetters from the limbs of the downtrodden white population of the South," is truly betraying a fascinating understanding of the situation here regarding exactly which race was being fettered in the South. So, of course, there are many counter-arguments to these claims he makes in his book. You can say that, the South wasn't contributing as much economically as they claimed, that it was also being supplemented by the North's manufacturing, by the North's trade, right? The South also relies on the North as much as the North relies on the South. It's not fair to say that the North is taking and not giving back. You can also say, I think it's also fair to say that just because there are women and children being counted in the census in the North doesn't mean that 3/5 compromise isn't kind of unhinged, frankly, because it, again, treats these people as less than, as not being people, which is directly counter to the ideals of the government as originally created. So, but you can see also from the Southern perspective why this was so compelling, for reasons just not entirely limited to, we want to preserve slavery, we think the Union is going to get rid of slavery, we can't have that. It's not just a question of the preservation or elimination of slavery, but a question of whether the promises being made in the compact that originally bound these people together are being upheld, regardless of the actual moral value of those promises. Not saying that, the South keeping slavery would be a good thing, because obviously it wouldn't. But if that was what was promised, can we not say that there's a right to, basically take yourself out of a promise that's already been broken, right? If somebody else breaks their promise first, what obligation do you have to remain bound by it? So that brings us to understanding that also, Bledsoe himself, and I agree with him very strongly on this point, says that it would not be just of the Confederacy to secede simply because they had a right to secede. They also had to have reasons. So he says that if the right to secede exists, if there is a legal reason that permits you to secede, like a legal method or an illegal method, as it may be, declaring war is also a method of secession, there's not necessarily a right to use that unless you actually have a reason for leaving the political entity you're wanting to separate yourself from. One of the authors I read the most when I was researching this, Alan Buchanan, he wrote a lot of the more interesting looks into developing theories of secession. Specifically, again, like I mentioned, in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, we were all looking at, Yugoslavia. He talks a lot about how there are specific times when secession is immoral because it weakens the people being seceded from. He brings up the specific case of a particularly more wealthy section of a country seceding from a overall more poor area that allows them to keep their wealth to themselves and not supplement the others. So basically, the point being made is that whether or not there is a legal right to secession, if there is no reason to secede, one should not be seceding. Now, modern theories of secession, like Buchanan's theories that I mentioned, rely on understanding the reasons for separation. There are a lot of reasons why one group might want to leave a country, of course. Here are a few examples. We have over here, as I mentioned, Yugoslavia. Now, no longer Yugoslavia. Please don't ask me to name every single country in the Balkans. But Yugoslavia was mostly torn apart by ethnic, religious, and cultural divides, and was benefited greatly by the fact that these were also roughly mapped onto geographic divides. One of the major principles brought up in a lot of discussions of secession is how important it is to have actual geographic divides that you can secede along. Like, obviously, we call it the South. It wouldn't be the same if, Maine had slavery, and then Georgia didn't have slavery, and then, right, we have all these different, scattered things. They wouldn't all secede in one block in quite the same way. And similarly, for Yugoslavia, it wouldn't be the same if the ethnic populations weren't already concentrated into their various areas. And we can see also we have historical wrongs as a very common reason for secession. We see the Quebec secessionist movement, which obviously has not achieved their goals yet. But we see that they still remember, je me souviens, they very much still remember exactly how they became part of Canada and resent it very greatly. So their reasons for secession are both, of course, to keep their cultural differences from the rest of Canada. We cannot pretend that they do not have those, but also because they think that the original reasons that they became part of Canada were wrong. They want to not necessarily avenge themselves, but undo what they see as an injustice that was done to their forefathers. There are also many, many other reasons for secession. There are religious reasons, which can also be grouped under cultural differences, obviously. There are economic reasons. Basically, any reason somebody can think of to want to secede, they've probably done it. Think of it, the Conch Republic. Sometimes people just want to leave the country. But overall, we can see that a lot of the time, our understanding of the worth of the secessionist movement is based on how strongly we sympathize with the ideals that secessionist movement is seceding based on. We can see that why we respect one secessionist movement and not the other has little to do with whether or not they're actually a legal right or even a natural right to secede, but whether or not they're seceding for what we see as the right reasons. We can sympathize with regions and groups that have been mistreated and want to exercise a right to self-determination in order to avoid further mistreatment. However, the example of the South reminds us that not all perceived mistreatment is actually immoral. There are moral and immoral justifications for secessionism. Wanting to preserve a cultural practice is reasonable until that cultural practice is the oppression of other human beings. Wanting to protect your economy is reasonable until said economy is founded on the abuse of other people. So, where I think a lot of discussion about the legality of secession goes wrong is that it introduces the concept of the right to secede, but fails to define it as a legal right or as a natural right, which are two different concepts. Whether or not there is a legal right to secede does not change whether or not there's a natural right to secede, because as we've acknowledged in political theory throughout the years, natural rights exist independent of the law. They exist whether or not the government is actively abridging them, and the government that abridges those rights is one that is in the wrong. So, is there a legal right for the South to secede? No. Is there a natural right for the South to secede? Well, I frankly think it seems very hypocritical for any American to claim that there's no such thing as a natural right to secede. After all, this nation really does only exist because the original colonies left the British Empire. While the basis for the Union argument against the legality of secession is, frankly, understandable if a bit convoluted, if your political worldview holds that natural rights not granted by the state exist as rights, you need to be able to recognize that you can have a natural right to something that you do not have a legal right to. If we acknowledge property as a natural right, if the government, takes away your property, do you have no right to it anymore? No, it's still yours, right? So you can follow the same thing for a more vague and undefined right, like the right to self-determination or the right to secede. Whether or not the government says it exists has no bearing on whether it actually does exist. Thus, I find it very difficult to argue that the South had no natural right to secede, even though secession was illegal. Conflating legality and righteousness is a very dangerous path to go down. We cannot believe that laws dictate morality, and we definitely know that morality does not dictate the law. So, having the right to do something does not mean that it can't, the natural right to do something does not mean that it can't be illegal, only that it shouldn't be illegal. However, we can recognize that the South had a natural right to secession while condemning why they chose to secede. While secession in and of itself is a morally neutral action, secession is, in order to preserve the institution of slavery, is, I think we can all recognize, profoundly immoral. Therefore, modern secession movements, I argue, should be judged by similar criteria. Whether or not there exists a legal right to secede in each respective case, I believe there is a natural right to self-determination which can be practiced individually or as a collective. I believe that, whether or not the government says, okay, fine, you can go then, or no, you need to stay part of our country, there is a right to self-determination that exists on a level above legality. Many international organizations, actually including the United Nations, have also proclaimed a natural right to self-determination. However, there is no international framework for addressing issues of self-determination. Each movement towards secession has been handled on an individual basis, and often we see a certain degree of hypocrisy and bias in how these are handled, including by international organizations like the UN. One of the examples I saw cited commonly was the secession of the Congo from Belgium, which was defended by the UN, even as secession of certain parts of the Congo from itself were put down by the same UN peacekeepers that defended the Congo's right to secede. In total, one of the things that's been greatly protected is the right of a colony to secede from its control and power, but areas without that political relationship have not had that right defended as stringently as those with that political relationship. For some reason, we see it as more morally justifiable for a colony to leave the empire that colonized it than any other political entity to leave another political entity. I believe that what the Civil War and the debate surrounding it teaches us, in terms of the ideology of secessionism, is that the right to secede exists, but it must sometimes be abridged in order to protect even more fundamental rights. The freedom of a nation cannot be prioritized over the freedom of a man. Thank you.